All right. Great. Thank you all for joining. It's great to see some familiar faces joining us today. It's great to see also new names joining us. Today we're kicking off the seventh event of our Circular Disruption series. We are excited to have Richard joining us from all the way from Luxembourg to talk about circularity and why does it matter. The goal of this series, as many of you know, is really to leverage the power of our community to educate the world around the importance of circular economy and sustainability. And specifically, we do believe that the transition to a circular economy really requires multiple disciplines to come together. And collaboration is core for us to achieve this. And so as part of the Circular Disruption series, we have tried to bring some of our thought leadership through our community to assist us all to understand how can we discover new possibilities for sustainable business models and for the design of regenerative solutions. So really excited to have Richard today. I'm proud to introduce him. He's a friend and a colleague at Amazon. Richard has led some innovative business models and launched strategic initiatives that have really shaped the course of how Amazon does business and its role in supply chain, pan-European supply chain. And more recently, he's taken over the responsibilities for the European Circular Economy team. So without further ado, Richard, after you, thanks for making the time for joining us today.
Thanks, Freddy, and thank you guys for tuning in to listen to what I have to say. Effectively, what we're going to cover today is obviously what is a circular economy and how I interpret it, and therefore the sort of Amazonian lens. You know, starting with why does it matter, and a bit of a definition, which is based on Ellen MacArthur, and I imagine most of you already know that, and then a little bit about why should we care. And then obviously what you can do yourselves for your own behaviors or within your own companies or within your communities to drive things forward. So that's what I'm going to intend to cover. This should be around 30 to 35 minutes, and then we can open it up to questions. I want to start with basically outlining the sort of what we would call the dominant consumption model today. And effectively, this is the linear, the take, make, dispose model. It's one that's actually very old. Many civilizations, even in before Christ BC, the Romans and others civilizations were following this, but effectively it was somewhat limited by the technology of the day and the productivity of the day. As we get towards the Industrial Revolution and we then begin to use machinery and the productivity takes off, effectively we avoided the typical Malthusian trap, the poverty trap, and effectively then the consumption and the productivity that it drove increases, the population therefore increases as well. And effectively find since pretty much the late 1700s till pretty much today, consumption and wealth have been significantly increasing. And then if you look at even just in the last sort of 80 years since the Second World War, and looking at that point, the pivot to GDP measurement, which pretty much put most of the global wealthy economies on a trajectory of growth, that in itself also began to drive globalization, and then beginning to be able to drive production at scale, extraction at scale, distribution at scale, which allowed, of course, more productivity gains, more wealth, and more consumption. And effectively, what we've done is to teach consumers to be able to want to be able to buy things, use them relatively quickly, and then dispose of them. We've taught them to buy new things rather than to reuse things, which is, a few generations ago, that was not the way. So this is hopefully it's relatively good news, because human behaviors are relatively, within a few generations are a little bit easier to change than something which has been very much our DNA for hundreds and hundreds of years. But before I get into the new sort of circular economy model, I just wanted to level set on some of the key facts that we see today, trying to answer the question of why should we care. There is, I don't know if folks are generally aware, but there's a concept called the Earth Overshoot Day. And this is us looking through the lens and the consumptions of Earth resources. The Earth Overshoot Day marks a date when humanity has used all of the biological resources that the Earth regenerates during the entire year. And this goes back 50 years in this particular graph, and you can see effectively one Earth in 1971, pretty much, represented by almost the full green bar. And you'll see effectively, except for a couple of bumps, effectively it's a downward trend the whole way, down to pretty much where we are this year, where I think July 28th was the day. So we're almost getting to 1.75 Earths, and we're on the trajectory to consume more. So effectively, we're using up a lot more than what the Earth can regenerate. So we're going into our inventory of resources as we try to replace. So this effectively means it is a downward spiral. And just to reflect on that, we've been lifespan on this Earth for almost 4 billion years. And yet, as you can see in the last 50, we've really begun to overuse those resources. If I now sort of take this kind of key message and then look at some research done by Luxembourg Ministry of the Environment, which then looked at our consumption of particular rare materials, key resources for our supply chains today, and sort of overlooked and said consumption today, how long would these last? And you can see gold at 45 years. You can see silver at 29 years, for example. So effectively, these resources or the extractions will run out within our own lifetimes. And in fact, that's one of the key challenges we have today is how do we keep these resources in the economy as long as possible. If we keep on landfilling them or incinerating them, then generally they will disappear, just as this says. And then if you take the third dimension, which is the rise of the middle class, and I look at the middle class because you'll see that's the biggest portion, the light blue on this graph itself. The lower class, the poor and vulnerable, are making what you might say are essential kind of consumption. As you move into the middle class and the upper class, you're into sort of the non-essential, which is resources we've got in many different ways. And effectively, this is, if you combine this kind of growth, and if you look, this goes out to 2040, and you see where we are today, which is just to the right of the COVID bubble, you'll effectively see that, given the projections of material exhaustion, given the projection of middle class growth, and with some of the area, the views on the Earth Overshoot Day, effectively in this generation or the next generation, we're going to find ourselves in a very difficult, lifestyle consumption patterns. So effectively, the conclusion is we really can't continue with the current business model, consumption model, the way that we live today. And that's going to be something that we really need to change. And that's why, effectively, there's a large group of people in many organizations, but also Amazon, which are now focused on how can we change our business model to be more circular. And as I said, it looks a pretty frightening position to be in. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, it's the closed loop model's been around for some time, but it's taking in the last sort of 10 or 15 years a little bit of a refresh or a rebrand under sort of the phrase circular economy. And effectively, there's three sort of elements to this, which is moving from the linear to a sort of three principled economic model. One effectively is how do we design out pollution, waste and pollution? How do we keep products and materials in use? And then how do we regenerate the natural systems, which is how do we ensure that our waste is somebody else's food? And this is effectively what we're trying to do in those two steps, at least in my company, which is how do we redesign to make things easier and more durable, more recyclable, to make sure the resources and either as product or material stay around much longer. And then how do we, because nothing's infinite, so how do we also build a decent recycling system to be able then to recover as much material as possible? If you look today around your own homes or offices or university or campus, you'll see a lot of materials which weren't built to be recycled. And so how do we take all those billions of tons of things that we have out there, and how do we make sure that they're not incinerated, that they're not landfilled, and that we recover as much as possible? So we have to do these things in parallel. We can't just focus on design. We also have to focus in terms of how we drive new innovation and new processes and technologies to make sure that we recover as much as possible. There are considerable challenges in doing it, and that's really sort of an area that I want to be able to understand and explain to you. There are considerable transition costs. The basis of our economic system today is in the take, make, destroy model, and therefore moving to something that's more circular. The transition from the business models themselves, the amount of assets and resources employed in the extraction business today will all but need to be redeployed, and this needs significant investment, and that's why you'll see a lot of it, particularly in Europe. You'll see a lot of legislation through what's called the European Union Green Deal, which is effectively looking at multiple elements of transition to a more sustainable future, one of which is the circular economy. And in the circular economy, they're particularly looking at packaging and product, and even within product, they're looking at how can we incentivize better product design. How can we ensure the product information that we provide to consumers to make better choices is right, isn't greenwashed, and is accurate and is standard and isn't going to confuse anyone? And then of course, then how do we then deal with disposal at the end of it? So how do we either delay disposal, or how do we put in incentives for the recovery of materials back into the supply chain? And that's a lot where those economic enablers become. But this is an area clearly of market failure, and therefore we need interventions to make some changes. We've been aware of this resource consumption model for some time. Private sector has failed really generally to get behind it, and so to now we find a combination of regulatory intervention and also some interventions on from the private sector side as well, particularly as the consumer and the customer is now recognizing the impacts of climate change, the carbon in our atmosphere, in around us, and also then the resource shortages that we'll find ourselves finding in the next few years. Clearly, the technical skills and how to run a circular economy is something which isn't set up today. It would need some considerable investment. The biggest one is the consumer behavior, and that's something which is taking a lot of research, and there still isn't necessarily insight to exactly how we are going to try and achieve that. But it is a tricky one, because effectively we have a relative laissez-faire model, at least in the mature economies, where we leave it up to the customer to make those right decisions. And a lot of their pricing's based on production capital and financial capital, but there is no reflection of nature capital. So those externalities, those social costs generated by the take, make, destroy model are not reflected in the costs, and therefore reflected in the prices that consumers have. And in basic economics, it is the suboptimal sort of allocation, and consumers will need at some point to have that correction, and that's going to be an uncomfortable one, and one which many consumers will avoid. But from what we see in Europe, we are crossing the chasm of key parts of the population, whereas before it may have been 10 or 15% of the population that was worried about the climate. We're finding the majority of consumers are worried about the climate and are making choices, better choices. One of those I'll hopefully talk about a little bit later. And of course, data. because our data today is not shared across multiple organizations. It doesn't necessarily measure the same elements. And as I said, it's missing the nature capital or the social costs or the externalities. And a lot of our setup today with all the data models is for the sort of buy model and own model rather than the durable model or the rental model or the share model, which is more the sort of circular kind of business models that we need to talk about and we need to expand and increase. Goodness, there's opportunities, which is always good to move into. Of course, the moving to a circular economy will reduce pressure on the environment because it means we can extend life of products. We can extend the resources or the materials within those through decent recycling systems. We can set up commercial opportunities at the end of the recycling infrastructure, so we can encourage that circle to move. And we can put in proper science-based targets to make sure that these behaviors and these changes are in line with where we want to drive. There has been a lot of misinformation in the past. There have been a lot of sort of targets and good intentions, and some of those we find that especially when you look across the sustainability drivers, such as reducing carbon and circularity and social or human rights elements in biodiversity, many of the decisions you might take in these individual pillars are not necessarily supportive of each other. You can go for a lower carbon solution, but end up being less circular, for example. So how do you build? You need science to be able to build models to allow us to be able to make those trade-offs correctly and embed those systems and ways of thinking in the way that we do business today. We also need to enhance security of our raw materials. The geopolitical situation is forever changing. It potentially is getting worse, and effectively that moves us away from the globalization that we've done today, which is good news from a carbon perspective, into maybe friend sourcing, or maybe even within a region like the European Union or a country like the United States, we'll find there's more onshoring and closer production and sharing of materials. So that's an area which I think will help us with the circular economy, because we can keep those resources within ourselves rather than leaving ourselves exposed to those geopolitical risks. As I said, the European community in particular is driving economic incentives. I also see that in the United States with the EPA. There are some incentives for investments for new materials, new products, for better and more effective recycling infrastructure, for example. And of course, it promotes innovation. This is a new way of doing business, and hopefully there'll be a lot more green jobs, not just in circularity, but in renewable energies and more circular buildings, for example. And hopefully that will allow us to grow new jobs. So move folks out of those sort of take, make, destroy models and invest them with new skills and new engineering into the more circular business models. It's not necessarily a big part of the economy in Europe at the moment, the rentals or sharing, but certainly the growth in the last 5 years has been quite impressive, and we foresee that continuing in the near future. I just wanted now to sort of pivot a little bit, since we covered some of the big challenges and opportunities of the sort of the circular economy model, to actually what we're doing at Amazon, and give you a brief view of how we interpret it and how we're driving it through ourselves. And we're relatively early in this journey, but we certainly have, as ever with Amazon, big ambition. On this particular slide is a summary of really what we're trying to drive. On the left-hand side, you'll see the typical linear economy and effectively Amazon's role in that today. And then effectively you'll see those services as the sort of the Amazon smile that is beginning to be more circular. So if you look at Amazon to the customer today, we're looking at how we were able to allow the customer to resell some of the goods they buy, to reuse, some of the packaging or some of the products that they have, how they could resell it as used, or if it's broken, how do I repair it, or how can I donate it, or how can I give it to a home for free, so that someone else can love it just as I have done, rather than potentially putting it in the trash or other sort of ways which happen today. Or if it's, it's new, and there's a slight issue with it, is it possible to be refurbished and then resold? And we find a lot of that with returns that get damaged. Then how can we do some basic refurbishment and sell it through, as we call it, Amazon Warehouse, which is a pretty big business, and we save a lot of units in doing that. And we've set up a lot of, refurbish elements, whether it be electronics or apparel or, accessories or those sort of categories. We can make certain sort of adjustments and sell them through those channels very successfully. And if it can't be repaired and it's too damaged, then we actually then look at harvesting those key raw materials or key components, which then can be used to help refurbish. And if it even, once we've stripped that, we then look at what we have left and then how we can shred what's left and then put it through working with our vendors, how we can sort those materials into single material streams, how they can go to reprocessing, and then making sure there's an end of market, a commercial side to that, because that's always the driver in the recycling piece. Is there a market for the raw material? If not, generally it doesn't get recycled. And so we need those industries on the other side to drive the market. And we've organized ourselves in those four pillars, effectively trying to, through a lot of support from the European community, some states interventions in the US and other countries, is how do we allow customers to shop more sustainably? How do we enable customers to recognize what is more circular than the other? And I'll give a short example, as alluded to before. In France, we launched a repairability index. So this is for a lot of the products we have. I think a lot. Let's say a lot of products, without necessarily giving a number. We're able to give a score in terms of how repairable it is. And we found in our first year of launching that actually consumers were spending more on more durable or more repairable products. So consumers were able to make that trade between buying something cheaper that may not last or may not be repairable, and paying a little bit more for something that will last longer and is repairable. And that gave us actually a bump in our sales. So looking in statistics through those products that didn't have it and those products that did, we were able to show a relative switch and improvement to the business. So customers are smarter as long as they're able to understand what is more sustainable or more circular, and they can trust that what they're reading is right. And that's key always in everything we do at Amazon, is the customer trust. So a very key one, because that, I think, is the fastest scaling of the circular economy, is having the customer pull it, because that certainly will change the selection that we sell. If customers are not buying the non-circular, non-sustainable selection, then that switch happens much, much, much quicker. And our vendors and our sellers will obviously then change their manufacturing and sourcing to follow the consumer dollar. The second one is alluded to before, is the services to extend product life. We already do warranty repair in Europe, and we'll be looking, and as those warranties extend from 2 years to potentially 5 years, which is what Germany wants to do, we're going to provide more services to allow customers to connect with brands, brand owners, or to use Amazon repair services to prolong the life of their product. Well, we also then have sellers that also sell used product, and we're that's been around for some time, but we find more and more interest, so we've been building more and more selection in that part of the world. And also we're going to allow now customers to donate directly. Clearly Amazon already does large donations around Europe and North America, but this allows customers to be able to donate their products, hopefully to avoid them going into the waste bin or into the even recycle side, because we'd much prefer for the product itself to survive. Product first, and if we can't sell the product, then how do we harvest the materials? The third element is a big area of customer concern, and we've been working to improve it, is the packaging itself. And there's two elements of that. There's the packaging that Amazon puts on top, and there's also the packaging that comes from the brands. And the most kind of easy way to describe that is with the consumables. So your detergent comes in a plastic box or a plastic receptacle. How do we, you use the consumable, but what do you do with that product afterwards? So we've been working very closely to reduce those problem and eliminate those problematic materials, whether they be single-use plastics or whether they be elements of even fiber that we don't actually need, because we've obviously come to the conclusion the best packaging is no packaging at all. So that's the first kind of area, to remove it. If you can't remove it, how, if you desperately do need it, how do you then reduce it and reduce the mass of it? And if you do need to use it, some of it, then how do you then ensure it's reused or recycled? And that's the sort of key themes that we're pushing through all of our packaging worldwide, and we're trying to influence our brands and our sellers to do the same. Last but not least, we're looking at obviously our own waste footprint and looking at across all the products, the buildings, whether they be the fulfillment centers or the corporate offices, the buildings themselves, in terms of the steel and the concrete and the material handling equipment that you'll find, like the conveyancing and all that steel in those buildings, and making sure that we kind of we know what we have, trying to make sure there are pathways which are, again, following the waste hierarchy. So reusing and recycling where absolutely necessary, as much as possible, and we're making good progress in doing that. Yeah, the last bit, as I said before, is pretty much, what can you do in the planet? Because, we look at organizations, we look at our regulators, and effectively, it's the consumers, it's the households that can make a very large difference. When I map out the flow of materials from what, for example, a material let's put on the market, and then what a household has, then the households into their bins for collection, then collection into sortation, sortation into reprocessing, and then the sort of feedstock that then feeds in. The biggest drop is actually the households. And therefore the consumer behavior is a big element. So if we can change our behaviors in our own households, we can make a really big change to how efficient and effective the recycling, because the recycling will respond by the more materials and the easier it is to sort of those elements as they bring in. So really, one of my last slides here is what can you do? And effectively, in your work or your research, it's about eco-design, pushing people upstream. How can we reduce or eliminate problematic materials? How can we change the design to be easy to disassemble? How can we make the design more durable, so it lasts a lot longer than it did before? And a lot of the big changes for the future years will come in that way. How do we use more recycled content? How do we make sure all of the products all the materials are recyclable, for example? And how do we make sure the materials are sustainably sourced, particularly if they're biological, like paper, for example, and making sure that we're following certifications and those elements. And of course, piloting business models. There's a ton, I think, of growth and opportunity in whether that's take back of old things, whether it's repair or trade in or used, resellers used. I think that whole economy is ready for rethink and an explosive growth. And you can see that today, if you just again reflect on some of those trends I covered in earlier, you know, there is going to be a lot of opportunities. You'll see raw material prices already, particularly in last year, go through the roof. You know, and whilst they may come down in the short term, the medium to long term outlook is high commodity prices, particularly with the weather impacts. But you know, as the resources become scarcer and scarcer, and the middle class grow and grow, demanding more and more. And I think also what people can do is just communicate clearly across the value chain on what is circular and how to recycle better. And that comes down to these kind of forums that you have today, which is, you know, circular disruption. Clearly, there's a business model today that doesn't work. How do we get to the new one? What does circularity mean? How can we, you know, change those designs upstream, and how can we make sure we do things differently downstream? And so this is really what this is all about. And as customers yourself, you know, reduce, reuse, and recycle as much as possible. Take an interest in those behaviors. Ask yourself, do I really need this? Ask yourself if I really need to own this lawnmower, which I might use once every 2 weeks. Do I need to own these power tools? Can I not have a share model in my street, in my community? Is there a way of making sure that, you know, everyone doesn't own a lawnmower in the whole district when actually they're being used? I think in particular use case research we did with one academic institute, lawnmowers were used less than 3% of their productive life. And that feels like a great opportunity to change how we do these things. So there are ways to rethink this through, which don't necessarily cost a lot, but will make a big difference overall. That was the key elements. I think it took about sort of 35 minutes, or almost approaching that. So hopefully we have time for questions.
Hello.
Thanks so much. Okay,
Yes.
go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Sean Kang speaking.
Sean, just a moment. I think we had a number of questions that came through. If you don't mind, could you post your questions to the chat so we can kind of go through them? There are quite a few in the queue. I just want to make sure we address those. Is that okay?
Go ahead, please. Okay, thank you.
So, Richard, earlier in the presentation, you talked about circular economy difference from recycling. And so can you expand and you know, through which lens people should think of recycling as part of the a circular business model?
No, sure. It's actually something that I get asked a lot, actually. The default from the general public is that, you know, circular economy is recycling. And so we go to great pains to kind of, you know, walk through the waste hierarchies, and pretty much the key element of the story of circular economy is that the product and the materials are best in their current form. And therefore recycling is the lowest form of circularity, in fact, which is once you exhaust all other combinations to reuse it, to repair it, to resell it, to pass it on, then if there's no other way that this product can be used, it has reached its end of life as its combination of materials, then how do we recover those materials to make sure they can be then reused with a new product, whether it's the same product or a different one? But it's often confused. I mean, we tend to look upstream, and if you look at the recycling rates that we have today, they're pretty poor. In effect, even some of the highest elements, like corrugate paper, you know, cardboard, the recycle rates are about, I think they go around the circle about 4 or 5 times before the fiber strands become shorter and shorter and shorter. They become so useless that they end up being sort of disposed of. So you know, it is important to understand that recycling, there is a loss of yield, there's a lot of energy that's used in those processes. So always better to keep it upstream as long as possible.
That's helpful. And so Katarzyna, I think, had a comment earlier on in your presentations. You were going through this theme and you talked about the repairability index, that the European community is focusing very much on the digital passport to collect information on data on products value chain. Yep. And there was also somebody else that asked the question, how do you see that supporting and helping the focus on making it easier for Amazon, you know, and for customers, I guess, to repair and recycle? And then do you see that repairability index also expanding beyond France?
Yeah, so there's two elements to that. Well, there's multiple elements. The Digital Project Passport is part of what's called the Sustainable Products Initiative, or SPI, which has been published as a consultation document. And actually, I think it's approaching in October or November. It'll be published in its final form. What does that mean in the European legislative context? It pretty much means this is it, and you get as a member country, and there's 27 countries in the European Union, you pretty much get 18 months to put it into law. But they set the floor. And of course, countries can go even more draconian. But the Digital Product Passport itself, the attributes are not necessarily clear at this point, but effectively they cover all different elements of sustainability. So there'd be carbon, biodiversity, water, energy, circularity. There's a whole lot of dimensions in that, and it allows hopefully a standardization and trust, and hopefully a certification methodology that people trust. So when the customer goes to the store, you will see be able to make the choice. When you look at your shelf, you'll be able to see the choice of, okay, what is more sustainable than others, and there'll be a rating which allow you to be able to make those choices. And so it will allow the customer that really wants to make a sustainable choice to do that and trust it. So that's the Digital Product Passport. And hopefully also that will have a bill of materials, and they will also then have the source of those materials, so where they're shipped from China or locally, how they're assembled, all of that data. And that data probably won't be at point of sale, but it will be easily, which is why it's digital, it'll be easy for the customer to be able to find out that data and learn themselves. But the key in all of this is to get away from the greenwashing and to get away with the multiple standards out there. Because you just look at today at the sort of certifications for greenhouse gas emissions and sustainability from products. There are multiple certifications, and customers get terribly confused, and some of those are deliberately confusing, and that's what the community wants to avoid. And we support it because effectively we've tried to drive a lot of those elements ourselves through what we call climate pledge friendly. But even we have got 35 something certifications, and it's far too many. And so we're hoping to be able to work with the European community and other companies like L'Oreal and Procter & Gamble that have been working on those sort of certifications to be able to find a way of simplifying this system such that the customer can make the right decision at the right time.
It looks like Cassia is nodding at you, and she's worked with the EU team on some of these initiatives. So it reinforces the role and your participation in trying to simplify the life for European consumer, which raises, kind of ties to
actually, Fede, just one point. I think she asked a question of, will it expand? And the answer is yes. Actually, the French circular economy, as ever, it's a bit like the US. You have the sort of federal kind of slowness because of the politics and so on, and the states have been super excited, like California, to get ahead. France is similar here in Europe. France has gone ahead, and they've launched a repairability index. They're going to be looking at a durability index that will roll out. But Amazon actually is going to go faster. So we're going to roll it out faster than the law is asking, just because, one, it's easy, and two, we can see the benefit for customers because they have responded. And as we thought, you give the right tools to the customer, they switch. Not everybody will switch, but we're finding a lot of folks are going, yeah, that's more repairable, I'll buy that. That's more durable, I'll buy that. And even though it's more expensive, they're making the right trade-offs.
And that ties into, there is a stream of questions around consumer behavior, Rich. I think you talked about how consumer behavior is influential in the effectiveness of the design of the supply chain for circularity. What do you think about more investment in consumer education versus forcing the consumers to change?
Well, I think it's one of those sort of elements of a free market economy that we allow consumers to make the right choices. But you're right, we need to give them the right information, not overwhelm them, and also information they can trust. And I think that's some of the challenges out there today. So I think some of the challenges we have is how do we cut through all the noise and be able to pull that together. I think customers now, the penny has dropped with as I said, there always was the 5 or 10% that I think they're called rather disparagingly tree huggers, that were always sort of there for the last 20, 30, 40 years. I think people now have seen the floods, they've seen the droughts, they've seen the storms, they've seen the impact of climate change. They can see that it's not just Africa and someone else's problem. It's actually home. It's with you. It's with your children. And the way that we're consuming means there'll be nothing for the children either, and I think that's driving them to make better decisions. And the more we can make that obvious to consumers at the point of sale, the better. I think when you walk into a store, you get so much different marketing. You end up going, I need this product, I need this product. And sometimes you don't necessarily in your mindset think about the sustainability of the product you're just about to buy. You'll think about price and texture and performance and all those kind of efficacy, all those kind of dimensions, and maybe sustainability isn't quite there. So with a digital product passport, and with I think people being aware of the impact on their lives today, they hopefully will be able to build into that set of inputs to choices a sustainability dimension, and hopefully the call to action will get higher and higher, that they'll start to place sustainability over the lowest price and over some of the criteria which consumers have used today. We've got to get away from the single use type of buying stuff and throwing it away rather than finding a new use for it. And I think those behaviors are changing, and we hope to accelerate them.
Great. I think there is actually a lot of interest in trying to make this work in everybody's company. And so there is a stream of questions around metrics and measuring effectiveness from a business point of view. So what kind of metrics could be used to help businesses measure their progress along? You talked about 4 pillars of focus for Amazon, but what are you finding effective in terms of measuring success?
So as ever, and I think it's similar of most multinationals. What gets measured gets managed, and therefore, what are the metrics and what are the goals? If you look at the carbon, impact, Jerry, there's a lot of research and understanding, and what is the price of carbon, and it differs, but the carbon price, I think, and building that into distribution algorithms and sourcing algorithms is now, I think, becoming more and more common. Valuing circularity in itself becomes a bit of a challenge because the amount of data, such as bill of materials and so on, that you need to be able to pull together. And so there's still some research to be done on that. We look at things like repairability. We can do, because we're online, we can do some wonderful tests where we could change descriptions to see, environmentally minded people bought this one instead. And we can see, as long as we're absolutely sure we trust the certifications, we can then see if customers respond, and then we can understand what are the mechanisms to make that happen in scale. Is there a cost of waste where we can build into our algorithms so that the buying we don't overbuy certain elements because we know in the past things have expired, so maybe we buy less because we build in the cost of waste to the overall profitability element of those things. But it's still, I think, a relatively new area. How do we value circularity? How do we embed it in decision making? Today everybody understands the ubiquitous nature of the greenback, the dollar. If we can make circularity a value that we can then put it into an overall costing model, then you'll find that we will look at performance and cost and circularity and carbon and biodiversity, and if we can value them all, we can trade them off, and then we can make the best decision for everything, for the company top line, for the company bottom line, for each of those impact areas we can do. But it's still a relatively early area. We're working very closely with scientists and with academic communities to kind of work out how we can share. Because the wonderful thing about circularity is it's an ecosystem concept. Amazon's less than 1% of global retail, so we can't change this on our own. We need to find allies. We need to find friends. We're building coalitions to be able to do this. And what we hope to drive in recycling technologies, or what we hope to drive upstream in new materials, is something to be shared. This isn't for Amazon only. This is something which hopefully, if we can get better recycling rates, more material recovery rates, it delivers to everyone.
There is actually, on that note, so there are two questions. One around on the four pillars. You talked about, I think it was from Sean. You talked about the four pillars, and are there any other circular initiatives, for example, around logistics management, Richard, that that Amazon is undertaking, and does it fit in the four pillar model?
In the circularity side, we're more focused on the product portfolio. If you look at our material flow analysis, effectively, almost 80% of the mass of our whole business, including buildings, is in products and packaging. Right, so almost 80% of everything of the total impact that we have on scope 1 and 2 and 3, effectively in the material mass, and so therefore we've focused on that part of the business first. There are elements of supply chain that are there that we'll need to focus on eventually, and we've looked more at the materials. So, for example, logistics. What packages are we putting it in? Are they recyclable? Are they reusable? If we use weather protection bags, are those recyclable? Are they problematic materials? And if they are, how do we eliminate those and replace them with better ones? How can we use reusable packaging where we send things to customers and they send it back? Again, this is where consumer behavior. We tested, as you're probably aware, in North America with Amazon Fresh, those little bags with the insulation, and they were reusable because they were expensive, so they were built to be reusable, and very few came back from customers. So we gave them to customers. We offered to pick them up when we delivered the new delivery, but very few came back. So again, consumer behavior. If you really want to get into reusability, it's quid pro quo. We can help it, but you need to give the thing back in order for us. The clue is in the name, reusable packaging. And so, but coming back to the original question, our biggest impact from material mass is our products we sell and the packaging that we use, and that's our main focus in the short term.
Great. And so can you talk about what you're doing downstream? We talked a lot about working with vendors. So can you talk a little bit more about what you're doing onstream? And then if you have any data on the products or the sectors that are seeing the largest wastage?
Like always, we've signed up to the food waste reduction. Food, I think, is the most sensitive, and I think it's where the wastage is highest. And the food business in North America, particularly the fresh business with Whole Foods, Amazon Fresh is an area that we want to really get donations and make sure that we donate things expiry, so we minimize that waste. Similarly, we have an ambient food business. Again, we need to be able to manage that before expiry. But I think the most sensitive area has always been food, because as you probably look worldwide, not just Amazon but worldwide, there's a lot of food is wasted, and yet there's a lot of starving people, and that's just a disaster that we as richer nations should easily be able to resolve, and we still find it difficult to do so. And so we're very committed to that. We signed up to the UN goal in North America and in Europe, and we're pushing that very, very fast ourselves to make sure that we deliver on that one. What are the other downstream things was your other part of the question? We're the biggest area that we found, we're looking at, as I said, two areas: upstream design, because that fixes the future. But today we know there's billions of tons of resources that sit in your homes and your factories and your offices and your campuses and everywhere else, just out there, all that stuff, which wasn't built for recycling, wasn't built for, durability potentially, wasn't easy to disassemble. So how do we deal with that? So that's what we're working at with waste vendors, is how do we do that? How do we, for every ton of those kind of products, how do we maximize material recovery? Today, most recycling systems are set up for packaging, whether it be boxes from e-commerce packaging and shipping, or the consumables, whether it's your plastic bottle for your detergent, or the plastic around your food elements. That's what it's built to kind of collect. But what about the products themselves? How many people can do curbside? Where do I put my electronics? Where do I put my apparel? Where do I put my shoes? That just isn't scale today. And when sent to most of recycling vendors. Again, they don't know what to do with it. They're not built for shredding and sorting and dealing with that at scale. So that's the kind of, you know, experimentation that we'll be looking at, that we are doing, and we're looking to scale, which is how do we, you know, how do we deal with the stuff today? We can't just walk away from it, because it all will end up in landfill or incineration unless we do it. Over the next 10 years, every year, billions, excuse me, billions of tons end up in the rubbish. Sorry, to get water. Good, thank you.
Thanks. I think we have one final question around a lot of circularity and business models around circularity that in some of the initiatives we discussed today require a strong infrastructure. And so are you seeing challenges in working with maybe vendors where that infrastructure may not be as established? Or I guess on the other side, with, you know, in operating in markets where customers may be more used to utilize products that might have a low repairability index.
Yeah, absolutely. We're hoping to sort of trial these technologies in areas where maybe we're easier to deploy, but the idea always will be roll it out worldwide. And as I said before, this is a coalition. This isn't a we solved it, therefore we'll keep it ourselves. So, you know, there will be some emerging markets and areas where the infrastructure isn't there. We're going to have to fast track that, frankly, but, you know, we'll trial it in the sort of more modern markets where the infrastructure might be quicker to deploy and where the engineering experience is, but we'll always look to roll it out. You know, when we take goals for waste and circularity, we'll do it globally. It won't be just US or Europe focused. You know, Europe tends to set the high bar for the world, like they did with the global data regulation, GDPR, and other countries followed. As Europe sets the bar in circularity and sustainability, other countries will follow. Others will struggle at first because they won't have the infrastructure, but we need to help them get there. A bit like some of the emerging markets skipping the sort of, you know, the old landline phones and so on, and going more to mobile without all that infrastructure and cables and so on. We kind of need to help them jump those models, so, you know, they don't end up with a lot of the waste that we're experiencing in the last sort of 50 years.
And I guess we have one final question for you, Rich, and then Manuel will hand it to you. How would you go about implementing circular economies initiatives in countries that have limited resources? And I guess a follow-up to that is, if you go a step higher, how do we, if we haven't started yet circular economy, what would you recommend the first step to take?
Yeah, I think I'll take the second one first, actually. I think it's, how would you start circular economy? I think it's mapping out your materials, your flow, the mass of materials and what you flow. So it's almost like scoping 1, 2, and 3, you know, in terms of following it through. What do we source? What do we use? Where, you know, 10 tons comes in, only 5 go out. So where do the other 5 go? And then also downstream, what happens to those 5 tons that go out? So start with your baseline and start looking up at opportunities to become more efficient. So 10 tons in, 10 tons out, and then making sure that the 10 tons flows back around the circle and tracing that. So finding ways, working with vendors to kind of go, okay, I'm interested in what you do with your stuff. Are you landfilling? You know, we would prefer you not to landfill if you're going to be our vendor, for example, and starting to push those changes through. But it all starts, I think, with a baseline that also then drive your where you want to go, and then hopefully your glide path will help you get there. And remind me the first part, sorry.
Yeah, the first part was how to implement circular economies initiatives in
countries
poor
who don't have the infrastructure. Well, I think that's yeah, the way that we've done it in other areas is we need to work with countries themselves. So this is where public policy becomes particularly important. So we're able to try and explain the benefits, but we'll need to walk hand in hand. So it's coalitions, it's working with the big corporates that are also in those countries, and with government institutions like the European Community, but in those other countries, and be able to say, okay, you understand the problems and the challenges. This is what we've learned, and we'll, maybe there's a co-investment model, maybe there's ways of making it work, maybe there's vendors in Europe that can expand to different markets and share those technologies. But the key in all of this is we need to share this stuff, because there's only one planet, and we all share it. So at some point we have to sort of break those barriers and just get on with it. And I think sharing this stuff is the only way forward. Europe can't exist in a microcosm. We need the rest of the world to change too. We know now that whatever happens around the world has consequences, has ripple effects, and we can't escape it.
Absolutely. And I think on that note, we can take a look, Manuel, on the next sessions. I think we're running out of time. Thank you, Richard, for spending time with us today, indulging the questions.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, Federico. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Federico, for this great session. We invite everyone to, if you want to take a copy, you can subscribe to the Circular Disruption series, and you can get the copy of this presentation and the other series of presentation. Our next, our 7th series of Circular Disruption is retrofit. It's on 8th of September. The retrofit is it's a panel discussion between leaders in the retrofit industry, but from every different segment of bicycles, cars, boats, coach, or trucks. And the speaker is Julie Miner on 8th of September. We invite you to subscribe to this series.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you today. I am on the road, so I cannot say hi. Cheers. Thank you, Manuel. That was great. Thank you, Federico. Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Juana. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jen,
Okay.
and thank you for your message.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
I think we can